comes a moment in life when we discover that not all secrets can remain buried forever. For Marcus Thompson, a senior at Roosevelt High School in Cedar Falls, Iowa, that discovery came brutally on an October afternoon when the smell of sweat and disinfectant from the boys' locker room mixed with something much more primitive and terrifying. The transformation had begun in the school locker room while he desperately tried to hide his dark past from his classmates. Marcus had always been different from the other boys, not just because of how he avoided contact sports or the way his eyes became restless during full moon nights. The difference was carved into his soul like a scar that would never fully heal. 3 years had passed since that terrible night in Minnesota when his family was attacked during a camping trip in the Boundary Waters. Marcus was the only survivor, or at least that's what everyone believed. What nobody knew was that he hadn't just survived. He had been marked, infected, transformed into something that defied all human logic. The bite on his right shoulder had healed long ago, but the curse it carried continued growing inside him like a spiritual cancer. Cedar Falls represented a fresh start, a chance to be just another ordinary teenager trying to graduate high school. His aunt and uncle, Margaret and Robert Hayes, had taken him in with genuine compassion, believing that all Marcus needed was stability and family love. They had no idea they were sheltering a creature whose primitive instincts constantly fought against his remaining humanity. The school locker room had become his refuge during the most difficult moments. It was there that Marcus hid when he felt the first waves of transformation threatening to emerge. The place had something comforting in its simplicity. Worn wooden benches, metal lockers rusted at the hinges, the constant echo of dripping water from poorly closed showers. It was an environment where nobody asked questions, where a kid could simply exist without having to explain why he sometimes trembled uncontrollably or why his eyes changed color when under pressure. On that particular afternoon, Marcus had arrived earlier than usual. Physical education class had ended, and most students had already left for their extracurricular activities or gone home. The silence of the locker room was broken only by the humming of fluorescent lights on the ceiling and the distant sound of some janitor pushing a cleaning cart through the school hallways. It was the kind of peace Marcus had learned to value, because he knew it wouldn't last forever. He headed to his locker, located in the farthest corner of the locker room, away from the busier areas. It was a deliberate choice. Marcus always sought out marginal spaces, places where he could go unnoticed. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the combination lock, not from nervousness but because something inside him was awakening. It was as if every cell in his body was being electrified by a current of ancestral and wild energy. What happened in the following minutes would remain etched in Marcus's memory as a sequence of physical and emotional sensations almost impossible to describe. First came the heat. Not the kind of heat you feel on a hot summer day, but something that sprouted from within his bones, radiating through his muscles like molten lava coursing through his veins. His hands began to sweat profusely as he struggled to maintain control over his own body. Marcus knew he was losing the battle against the creature that dwelt within him. There were unmistakable signs he had learned to recognize over the past 3 years, the way his vision became sharper, capturing microscopic details in the textures of the locker room walls, how his ears picked up conversations happening in distant classrooms, how his sense of smell intensified to the point where he could distinguish the specific scent of each person who had passed through the place in the last few hours. He leaned against the cold wall of the lockers, trying to use thermal shock to interrupt the transformation process he felt accelerating inside him. His breathing became labored, as if his lungs were being compressed by an invisible force. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to focus on the mental control techniques he had developed during the darkest months after his family's death, visualizing calm places, repeating silent mantras, forcing his mind to disconnect from the primitive instincts that threatened to dominate him. But this time was different. The transformation wasn't being triggered just by the proximity of the full moon or a moment of intense anger. Something deeper was happening, as if the very presence in the school locker room had activated buried memories he thought he had managed to suppress. The place vaguely reminded him of the last place where he had felt truly safe, the wooden cabin where his family used to gather during summer camping trips before everything was destroyed on that terrible night. Marcus opened his eyes and realized his vision had subtly changed. Colors were more vibrant, contours more defined, and he could see perfectly even in the darkest corners of the locker room where lighting was poor. It was as if some primitive switch had been flipped in his brain, awakening capabilities that human evolution had abandoned thousands of years ago. His pupils dilated and contracted rapidly, automatically adapting to light variations in a way no normal human eye could. The sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway outside made Marcus freeze instantly. His amplified hearing picked up not just the footsteps, but also the breathing pattern of the approaching person, their heart rate, even the almost imperceptible sound of clothing fabric moving against skin. It was like having a biological radar that provided detailed information about any human presence within a radius of several dozen meters. Panic began to set in when Marcus realized he could no longer control the physical changes that were occurring. His nails were growing and becoming sharper, not dramatically, but enough for him to notice the difference when he ran his fingers over the metal surface of the locker. The skin on his hands began to tingle as if thousands of tiny needles were being inserted simultaneously into every pore. It was the beginning of hair growth, a process he knew was irreversible once started. The locker room door opened with a metallic creak that reverberated through the space like a cannon shot in Marcus's hypersensitive ears. Every fiber of his being contracted in a spasm of pure terror when he recognized the characteristic smell of Jake Morrison, the captain of the wrestling team, known for his aggressive nature and tendency to torment any student he considered different or weak. It was exactly the kind of confrontation Marcus had spent 3 years trying to avoid. Jake entered the locker room with the arrogant confidence typical of popular athletes, his heavy steps echoing against the concrete floor. Marcus could hear not just the footsteps, but also the sound of blood pumping through Jake's arteries, the accelerated rhythm of his heart after wrestling practice, even the almost inaudible sound of sweat evaporating from his heated skin. It was too much sensory information for a human brain to process, and Marcus felt a wave of nausea mixed with something much more dangerous. A predatory instinct that whispered in his mind that Jake represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. Marcus pressed himself even more against the lockers, trying to become invisible while fighting against the changes that continued accelerating in his body. His hands were trembling uncontrollably now, not from fear, but because muscles and tendons were reorganizing into a more primitive and powerful configuration. He could feel the bones in his fingers elongating slightly, joints becoming more flexible, palms developing a rougher texture that would provide better grip for climbing or grasping prey. The real terror didn't come from the physical changes themselves, but from the growing difficulty in keeping his human consciousness in control. There was an inner voice that became louder and more insistent every second, whispering thoughts that weren't his, hunting strategies, analyses of Jake's weak points, instinctual calculations about how he could subdue the young athlete if necessary. It was like having a mental parasite that was gradually taking control of his cognitive processes. Jake headed to the showers, apparently unaware of Marcus's presence in the distant corner of the locker room. The sound of running water should have been comforting, but to Marcus's altered senses, each drop hitting the floor sounded like small explosions. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block the sensory bombardment, but this only intensified his perception of odors in the environment. Jake's musky smell of sweat, cleaning chemicals, oxidized metal from the lockers, and underneath it all, his own scent that was changing in a subtle but unmistakable way. The transformation had reached a point where Marcus knew he could no longer pretend he was just going through a moment of teenage anxiety. His reflection in a small, polished metal mirror inside his locker revealed changes that left him paralyzed with horror. His eyes had acquired a golden hue that glowed slightly in the artificial light of the locker room. It wasn't something a casual person would notice immediately, but any closer observation would reveal there was something deeply non-human in that gaze. Even more disturbing was the way his facial expression had changed. The muscles around his mouth and jaw were reorganizing, creating a slightly more projected structure that suggested the beginning of a snout. His lips seemed thinner, and when he opened them involuntarily, he could see that his canines were more elongated and sharp. They weren't complete fangs, but they definitely weren't normal human teeth. Marcus touched his own face with trembling fingers, feeling the texture of his skin that was becoming slightly thicker and rougher. Small hairs began to emerge along his jawline and on the sides of his neck. Not the kind of sparse beard some of his classmates had begun to develop, but something denser and wilder that grew in patterns following primitive instincts rather than normal human genetics. The situation deteriorated drastically when Jake turned off the showers and began drying himself with abrupt movements that made the towel crack in the air. Each sound was amplified in Marcus's ears, as if someone were beating drums inside his head. Worse still, the relative silence allowed Jake to finally realize he wasn't alone in the locker room. His eyes scanned the environment until they located Marcus, huddled in the farthest corner, and a cruel smile formed on his lips. Jake had always been the type of person who found pleasure in exploiting others' weaknesses, and Marcus's defensive posture was like an invitation for him to exercise his social dominance. The young athlete approached with the predatory confidence of someone who had never faced a real threat in his life, completely unaware that he was walking towards something much more dangerous than he could imagine. To him, Marcus was just another weird, withdrawn kid who deserved to be put in his place. Marcus could feel Jake's approach through multiple sensory layers that overlapped almost synesthetically. The athlete's body heat created thermal air currents that Marcus could mentally map. The smell of testosterone and adrenaline emanating from Jake was so intense it almost had taste. More disturbing still, Marcus could hear Jake's heart rhythm and instinctively knew the young man was experiencing excitement from anticipation of conflict. Exactly the kind of aggressive energy that the creature inside Marcus interpreted as a direct territorial challenge. The inner voice that had been whispering during the entire transformation now screamed combat strategies. Marcus knew exactly where Jake was most vulnerable, the carotid artery pulsing visibly in his neck, the soft spot just below the ribs where a precise blow could puncture vital organs. The way Jake favored his left leg due to an old knee injury that Marcus could detect from the slightly irregular walking pattern. This was knowledge no 17-year-old should possess. Predatory insights that belonged to something much more primitive and lethal. Jake stopped a few meters away, his hands on his hips in an obvious dominance posture. He commented on how Marcus always seemed to be hiding, questioning if there was something wrong with him that made him avoid other students' company. There was casual cruelty in his voice that Marcus recognized as the type of psychological bullying he had learned to fear, not just for the social humiliation it represented, but because he knew his reaction could easily spiral out of control. The problem wasn't that Marcus was afraid of Jake in any conventional sense. The problem was exactly the opposite. He was beginning to see Jake not as a schoolmate or even as a bully, but as prey. The transformation had progressed to the point where hunting instincts were becoming more powerful than his human consciousness. Marcus could visualize with disturbing clarity exactly how he could incapacitate Jake. A quick movement to break balance, clawed fingers finding pressure points on the neck, teeth finding the soft throat. Marcus's breathing became heavier and more irregular, not from fear, but because his cardiovascular system was adapting to the demands of a predator preparing to attack. His heart pumped blood in a different cadence, optimizing flow to muscles that were reorganizing under his skin. Jake interpreted the altered breathing as a sign of nervousness and intensified his intimidating posture, completely unaware he was provoking something infinitely more dangerous than a scared teenager. Marcus clenched his fists in a desperate attempt to maintain control, but the movement revealed that his nails had grown considerably and become concave like primitive claws. The pain of his own nails piercing his palms was enough to create a moment of mental clarity where he could fully comprehend the gravity of the situation. If the transformation continued progressing in Jake's presence, there would be no way to hide what was happening, and the consequences would be catastrophic for both of them. The decisive moment came when Jake made the fatal mistake of touching Marcus's shoulder. The physical contact was like completing an electrical circuit that had been building tension throughout the entire transformation. Jake's hand landed exactly on the old bite scar that had changed Marcus's life forever, and the touch triggered a cascade of biological reactions that could no longer be contained or reversed. Marcus felt every cell in his body respond instantly to the contact. It wasn't pain, but rather a sensation of explosive release, as if some fundamental barrier between his humanity and his bestial nature had been completely destroyed. His muscles expanded visibly under his orange school shirt, which began to stretch dangerously at the seams. The transformation that had been developing gradually during the last few minutes now accelerated at a speed that defied any medical or scientific understanding. Jake stepped back, his expression of cruel superiority quickly being replaced by confusion and then by something very close to primordial fear. Even without consciously understanding what he was witnessing, his most basic survival instincts recognized he was in the presence of a predator. The smell emanating from Marcus had changed completely. It was no longer the odor of a nervous teenager, but something musky, wild, that awakened ancestral memories buried in human DNA about creatures that hunted in darkness. Marcus tried to speak, to try to explain or at least warn Jake to get away, but discovered his vocal anatomy had altered to the point of making human speech almost impossible. What emerged from his throat was a guttural sound that was somewhere between a moan of pain and a growl of warning. His vocal cords had thickened and elongated, adapting to produce frequencies that could carry through dense forests and communicate primitive emotions that had no equivalent in human language. Marcus's vision was now completely altered. The world had acquired hyper-detailed clarity where he could see every pore in Jake's skin, every individual fiber in the young athlete's clothes, even the microscopic pattern of fingerprints on his hands. More disturbing still, Marcus could see Jake's body heat as a glowing aura, automatically mapping points where blood flowed closest to the skin's surface. It was like having biological X-ray vision that revealed all the vulnerable points of potential prey. Marcus's arms elongated slightly, his shoulders broadened, and his posture became more forward-leaning in a configuration that optimized both speed and explosive force. His hands were now unequivocally non-human, elongated fingers ending in curved claws that could tear through flesh and muscle with terrible ease. The skin on his hands and forearms was covered with patches of dark hair that grew in patterns following lines of muscular force. Jake tried to back away further, but his legs seemed to have lost the ability to obey his brain's commands. It was as if some primitive survival mechanism had activated a freeze response, instinctively recognizing that trying to flee from a predator in this state would only intensify its hunting instincts. The terror in his eyes was pure and unfiltered, the kind of fear humans rarely experience in the modern era, when death by predation became something that only exists in wildlife documentaries. Marcus could feel the humanity remaining within him, waging a desperate battle against the creature that was emerging. It was like being trapped inside his own body, watching through eyes that didn't completely obey his commands, feeling muscles that responded to instincts that weren't his. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings about the consequences of what was happening. The impossibility of explaining such a transformation, the complete destruction of any chance at normal life, the terror Jake would carry for the rest of his existence. But the creature didn't care about social or moral consequences. It had identified a territorial threat and was responding according to millions of years of evolutionary programming. Marcus could feel his own human thoughts being gradually suffocated by something much older and more implacable that saw Jake not as a schoolmate, but as an invader who needed to be dominated or eliminated. What saved Jake Morrison from a terrible fate wasn't courage or physical strength, but the distant sound of voices echoing through the school's main hallway. The janitor had found other staff members, and their casual conversations about weekend plans penetrated through the locker room walls like a brutal reminder of the normal world that still existed beyond that nightmarish transformation. For Marcus, those ordinary human voices functioned as an anchor that pulled him back from the edge of the bestial abyss where he had been balancing. The creature within him hesitated for one crucial moment, its predatory instincts conflicting with the perception that there were other humans nearby who could represent a greater threat than Jake. It was exactly the kind of tactical calculation a wild predator would make. Assess whether attacking isolated prey was worth the risk of exposure to a larger group. This momentary hesitation was enough for Marcus's human consciousness to regain partial control over his mental processes. Marcus took advantage of this window of opportunity to force his own retreat from the situation. With movements that were simultaneously human and animalistic, he moved away from Jake toward the back exit of the locker room, an emergency door that led to the athletic fields behind the school. Each step was a battle between his conscious will and the creature's instincts that wanted to turn around and finish the confrontation with Jake in a definitive and bloody way. Jake remained paralyzed for several minutes after Marcus disappeared, his body trembling with residual adrenaline and his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. He knew he had seen something impossible, something that defied everything he thought he knew about reality and human nature. But he also knew instinctively that trying to explain that experience to anyone would only result in disbelief and possibly concern about his mental health. The trauma of the encounter would crystallize in his memory as a secret he would carry alone. Marcus ran through the school fields until he reached a small wooded area that separated the campus from the residential neighborhood where he lived with his aunt and uncle. The transformation was beginning to regress, but the reverse process was almost as painful as the initial change. His bones seemed to be contracting inside his skin, his muscles reorganizing into a more compact and human configuration. The claws gradually retracted, leaving his nails bloody and broken. The hair that had emerged along his arms and face began to fall out in tufts, leaving his skin irritated and hypersensitive. When he finally recovered a sufficiently human appearance to return to civilization, Marcus discovered his clothes were torn in several places and stained with blood from small cuts where his own claws had pierced his skin during the transformation. He had to invent a story about having tripped and fallen into some thorny bushes during a run, a lie his aunt and Uncle Margaret and Robert accepted without question, too worried about his apparent injuries to investigate details. That night, while lying in his bed trying to process the day's events, Marcus understood he had crossed a fundamental line. The transformation in the locker room hadn't been just another episode he could hide and forget. It had been more complete, more intense, and harder to control than any previous change. Worse still, he knew Jake had seen enough to know something was deeply wrong with Marcus Thompson. From that moment, Marcus knew his days in Cedar Falls were numbered. He could no longer pretend he was just an ordinary teenager dealing with family trauma. The creature inside him was growing stronger, more insistent, and less willing to remain hidden. Jake would keep quiet for a while, but eventually someone else would witness a transformation, or he would lose control completely in a situation he couldn't escape from. As he looked through his bedroom window at the waxing moon shining through the trees, Marcus made the decision he had been avoiding for 3 years. He would have to leave the safety of his new family and find a place where he could exist without putting innocent people in danger. The transformation had begun in the school locker room, but Marcus knew it would only end when he finally stopped running from what he had become and learned to live with the monster that now called home, the space where his soul used to reside. The next morning, Jake Morrison would miss school for the first time in 2 years, claiming to be sick. Marcus Thompson would attend classes normally, but any observant person would notice he completely avoided the locker room area, and that his eyes now carried a deep sadness that hadn't been there before. The secret that had begun to unravel that October afternoon would continue growing like an infected wound, irreversibly changing the lives of both young men in ways that neither science nor medicine could explain or cure.